Welcome to the Affirming Village Podcast, where we center neurodivergent voices, affirm diverse ways of being, and empower families, educators, and advocates with knowledge that truly honors the whole learner. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic ADHD mental health therapist and non-attorney special education advocate, and Lisa Baskin Wright, an ADHD and dyslexic educator and IEP coach. Together, we dig into conversations about neuroaffirming practices, special education, and disability rights. Please remember, nothing shared on this podcast is medical or legal advice, and the views shared here by the host and the guest are their personal opinions. This space is for educational purposes only, to help you feel informed, empowered, and never alone in the village. Welcome back to the Affirming Village, the podcast where parents, educators, administrators, and related service providers come together to build neuroaffirming spaces for neurodivergent learners.
Here, we don't just talk about supports and systems, we talk about the humanity behind them, because every learner is more than a set of goals, accommodations, and service minutes.
And that brings us to today's episode, which is episode 11 of Your Learner Deserves More Than Services. This is a conversation for anyone who works with or raises neurodivergent learners, and for anyone who's ever felt the weight of an IEP that's technically compliant, but emotionally empty.
Yeah, we're diving into the difference between services and support, between checking boxes and actually meeting needs, and between doing what's required and doing what's right.
Because a learner isn't transformed by 30 minutes of OT or speech. They're transformed by environments that affirm who they are, adults who see their strengths, and teams who understand their communication, sensory, executive functioning, and emotional needs.
We'll talk about what happens when schools rely on service minutes instead of relationships, when teams prioritize compliance over connection, and when the system forgets that neurodivergent learners deserve belonging, not just intervention.
And we'll also get into what a truly neuroaffirming support plan looks like, one that centers identity, autonomy, safety, self-advocacy, and regulation, not deficits.
So whether you're a parent advocating for more than the bare minimum, an educator trying to shift your practice, or a provider navigating burnout and bureaucracy,
you're in the right place. Oh, we had to do that line together. So remember, all our episodes start out with the script. So that's why you see we were like trying to get it on timing, and neurodivergently we did not.
It was great.
So let's talk about why your learner deserves more than services and how we build systems that finally honor that truth. So I think that this episode is so important and timely because there's a lot going on in the United States right now, and with education, special education. And I personally am seeing a lot of school systems revert back to things that we had kind of, I won't say gotten away from, but we had more understanding about and were more flexible about. And I think now they're kind of being emboldened to go back to what they think was working, but really was just compliance that was preventing disabled learners from accessing the setting.
Yeah. I mean, as always, 12 million thoughts all happening and ping-ponging around my brain at the same time. But to me, this is really kind of a foundational difference between traditional advocacy and neuroaffirming advocacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you can be checking all the boxes and like following all the right procedure and, yada, yada, yada. But if you're really not centering who this learner is and what their temperament is and, what supports and interventions are best practice for them and who they are as a human and like all the things, that IEP is doomed to fail.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what you're speaking to is that, and I just did a consultation the other day where the parent is like, they're telling me we're doing everything that's in the IEP. We're doing everything in the IEP. And I'm like, and that's one of the times where we have to go. So if you are doing everything in the IEP, then it's not working. And that's where we have to look at the fact that if it is built through a compliance lens, then most likely that's why it's not working. And you're doing what's in there, but we need to adjust it and we need to have a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I have like so many different kids kind of popping into my brain as we're starting to dive into this. And I remember, gosh, it was a couple of months ago, but unfortunately it's still very true for this learner, and it's true for so many others, where like on paper it sounded fine, like the IEP itself was like okay, and they had taken some of the input into consideration, and it's like okay, but I didn't hear one person say anything about a relationship with this learner. I didn't hear one person talk about like, you know, a shared passion with this young person or a way that they're connecting with them. There was like, it was so absent. And I remember writing it into my notes because it just struck as such a profound missing element. And then I jumped onto Instagram like right as we logged off and after I had talked to the parent, of course, but like to just like, it just felt so vacant and so empty, and this particular situation has gone down a really dark and awful path, and this young person is suffering. And I think that at the core of it is that these folks are, my dad always kind of, he has a phrase that he refers to when this happens of like a checklist mentality, that like, you know, you go and folks are just like, well, I checked the list, but you're not really thinking about the impact of the list and the nuance that's not on the list, and right. And, you know, in this particular situation and in far too many situations, we're missing the point. And it's ultimately the learner who is suffering.
100%. And I like to even take that statement a step further, right? Because a constant theme in the United States right now and across education is like schools, you know, in schools is that like we've lost sight of XYZ. Kids are able to do whatever they want. There's no accountability. There's no responsibility. And I always like to flip that narrative and say like, there's no accountability and responsibility on anybody if you want to take it there. We've lost sight of what spaces used to be. We lost sight of like where children used to be able to access. And there's such a separation between learners that are disabled versus non-disabled in that interaction. And we used to have less separation, but also less compliance in that sense. And so I just kind of want to like take everyone back, since we're talking about your learner deserves more than the services, right? So Lisa and I are in different age brackets, which I know Lisa's like, thank you for mentioning that.
That's all good. She owns her 51 years, almost 52.
And looks amazing doing it. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And so she's early 50s. I'm late 30s. I'm almost 40. And so there was a time where, yes, education was like, you know, you're getting paddlings in school and things like that. And then we made the shift. And I think we shifted into a certain sweet spot, I like to call it, where we start to recognize we have disabled learners that don't deserve to be segregated, deserve to be supported, deserve to have access. And children were still allowed to play, and they were still allowed to come to school to socialize and engage and enjoy. And I always tell everyone, I remember my high school teacher, like my junior year, US history, and him going, okay, lesson, assignment, as long as y'all aren't over there acting up, like, go ahead. And acting up wasn't us talking and chatting and joking and laughing. That wasn't considered disciplinary. And he was like, I did my part, right? And kindergarten through second grade was play, and it was interaction, and it was, you know, with their peers, and it was learning how to have those social interactions in a safe way and feel comfortable and build friendships. And we've gotten away from that. And so in turn, getting away from that, we're no longer as accepting of disabilities. We're no longer, you know, teachers are on a to the minute schedule. I mean, like my kid has lunch at like 11:52, right? So it's like, they're like to the minute. And so everyone is stressed and fractured. And so when we talk about the learner getting the brunt of it, you know, I know right now educators are listening or parents are listening where their learner is not considered a quote unquote behavior concern or issue or problem. And they're going, what about my child? And the educator's going, what about me? Right. And it's like, but when you support the learner and you look at what you're actually providing in service and access, you're actually supporting the educator and you're supporting their peers in the classroom. And I think we need to adjust that narrative for them to access the necessary services and supports. And so I love how you're like your dad said about the checklist, because I talk about this a lot when like you have that once a year annual IEP meeting, right? And I've mentioned this several times since we've been doing the podcast where, like, rightfully so, the district has a compliance piece they have to go by. And so it's like, we have to make sure we check these things to comply with how we run this IEP meeting, right? And so when you look at that in the service piece, they're going, okay, this is the need. This is the service, accommodation, or goal. And we're applying that. We're covering SDI. So for my parents listening, that's specifically design instruction. In some states, it's called SAI. But essentially, it just means like, literally, this is why your learner qualifies for an IEP, because they need something individualized to them to access this educational environment. And so they check that box, but then we don't get into the detail, the nitty gritty, the nuance of what does that actually look like? And are we supporting the learner, affirming the learner, or are we just checking a box that makes us feel better?
Right. No, I'm thinking about an IEP. I'm just coming off of a week of like, I lost track of how many meetings, too many. Destiny has promised me that she won't ever let me schedule myself.
Yes, we're working on Lisa's self-care.
Yeah, Lisa's not very good at it, but that's okay. Details. I had a meeting yesterday afternoon with a team I've worked with for a while. Mm-hmm. It's an autistic learner who is in elementary school. Mm-hmm. Main placement is in a self-contained classroom, but we've been advocating for quite some time for more time in the general education space. And without mm-hmm. getting like too super into the weeds to protect, obviously, confidentiality, this young person, like, academically is very much so on grade level. Like, they just went through their try. That was yesterday's meeting, was the first part of the try, annual review. So for those that are kind of new to the process, every 3 years, you have to go through all the testing. Well, you don't have, like, mm-hmm. I'm just for the sake of this going to say every 3 years you go through the testing. There's different ways every 3 years that you can get present levels and reevaluate. But for the sake of this, and this young person did have to go through like the battery of standardized tests and observations and like all the things. And their scores in many areas were like literally off the charts. And so every single person in the room was like, wow, we don't normally see scores like this, right? Mm-hmm. In the 99.6th percentile, mm-hmm. right? Like, and yet they are definitely pushing for this young person to remain in the segregated space because mm-hmm. they don't really know how to support the dysregulation. They don't really know how to support the executive functioning differences, I should say. There isn't a real acceptance of the motor differences and how those motor differences are impacting access. Mm-hmm. And these are actually very thoughtful, kind folks. Like I actually mm-hmm. really like them. Mm-hmm. And I think they're showing up with heart and care. But as I was debriefing with the parent after the fact, they're looking through a micro lens and not a macro lens. Mm-hmm. And there has to be a balance. So when we first started having this conversation about like wanting more time in general education, they mm-hmm. had sort of breezed through the assessment of harm part of the IEP. So when you get, during your IEP meeting, when you get to the point where you're talking about placement and, okay, we've got goals and we've got some service minutes and like, where does it make the most sense for us to be supporting this learner and working on these goals and, you know, all the things, there's an assessment of harm. You know, time away from non-disabled peers, time with disabled peers, and non-disabled peers, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. And they had kind of breezed through it.
Now, I just want to pause right there.
Please do.
Is that, you know, just for all, because I'm always learning too, is that something that is actually like titled or termed in like California, or?
I've seen it mostly in California, so it could just be a California thing.
Okay, because
I am not 100% sure.
Okay, because like in Georgia, we don't have like, it's not like an assessment of harm. We don't have, when we're talking about placement, we do take into consideration what they consider like behaviors. So they'll say like, is the learner at risk of harming themselves or others, in the sense of a behavior piece? Is there a lot of behavior, quote unquote, when they are being assessed in that general education setting? But we don't actually have, like, we don't term it like assessment of harm. So that's why I just wanted to check in for that piece in case there's people listening like, oh, are they supposed to be doing that? It might be
Oh, that's a good question.
specific. Yeah.
Thank you for checking me. I've seen it mostly in California. I do not know. My strong feeling, my opinion, as it is, is that whether it's formally written in or not,
100%.
there should be a conversation about what's the risk benefit analysis
Right.
of having a young person in a segregated space versus in a mainstream environment. What does the ratio look like? So if it isn't like built in to your
right,
IEP,
you should be having a conversation about why you're wanting to do the specific placement and what is the harm to the learner as well to others. 100%.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's more formalized in California, and I can't speak to if it's formalized elsewhere, and I should be able to, but I can't. So there you go.
No, you should not. We support all over, and we have, obviously, for those listening, Lisa and I advocate for families all over the United States. And so, a lot of times we will speak in generalities, but you'll also hear us specify if there's, because she's physically located in California, I'm physically located in Georgia. So you will hear us like specify some things that are specific to our state. And so that's just kind of why we just had that conversation. Now, Lisa, do you remember where you were going with your comment now that I interrupted it?
Kinda. I love it. Yes, so they had kind of breezed through that.
Right.
And I had said, hey, can we go back?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the parents' concern, and I think a lot of parents share this concern, is from perhaps a regulation perspective, or right, there's a million reasons why a segregated space potentially could meet the needs of a learner. But the piece that is of top concern often for parents is that, like, it's not the same access to grade level rigor. And so a lot of times that decision, in my humble opinion, is not actually based on real information. It's based on bias and assumption.
100%.
And not really understanding disability and all the things. And so in this particular case, I was like, we need to go back to that, because this is a young person who we agree is like able to and ready for grade level curriculum. I could go off on a whole separate tangent about readiness. I'm gonna stop myself. But in this particular case, like, learner was able to demonstrate readiness. So it was really like quote unquote behavior that was keeping them in the segregated space.
Right.
And they are an autistic human who thrives on kind of knowing what's coming down hike, right? Like routine based and all the things. And so to disrupt their program mid-year and like, you go here and wait, no, you go here, right? Like, it's disquieting for this young person.
Right.
And so we had to be really thoughtful about like, well, what could inclusion time look like, and how are we making that meaningful, and what does the support look like for when they mainstream? And okay. So we managed to get them to move the needle at the start of the year, but they really didn't provide the support that should have been in place, because I know you're in cringe. You ready for it? A para is the most restrictive environment.
I hate it so much.
Like blood is coming out of our ears.
I hate it so much.
It's so ridiculous. And so we tried to get some level of para support in the room, but they really were only willing to offer like during the transition in and out. And it's like, oh my gosh, right? And so they showed up with their data that this young person is not producing anywhere near the same amount of work in the general education setting as they are in the segregated space, and therefore this learner should be in the segregated space, while at the same time saying, oh my goodness gracious, we never see scores like this. And I'm like, because he never should have been put in a self-contained classroom in the first place. This should have been a learner placed in a general education setting with resource support, with one-to-one para support, perhaps at the start, bell to bell, but like, this is not a young person that should have been segregated, and y'all did anyway because they're an autistic human with quote unquote behaviors that you don't understand. And so it's going to be an interesting part two, because they're trying to like build the case, and we're also trying to hold space for this learner, right? Because the learner knows the teacher and the kids in the segregated space and now associates school as that being their classroom. And,
right.
You know, and so we want to make sure we're holding them well and their emotional well-being well. And at the same time, like, what does keeping them segregated ultimately mean
like?
for their long-term education? And so it is nuanced.
It is 100%.
But we have to be thinking about this learner. We have to be thinking about every learner with this level of depth and thoughtfulness, because it's not just like, I know the folks around that table mean well. And they see a distressed learner in their classroom and they want to take care of this learner.
Right.
But it's like, we have to recognize and kind of own that some of the decisions that we have made have caused harm. And so do we just keep making them because we've caused harm, or do we figure out a strategic way to pivot? And I
100%.
think it's the latter, but I'm anticipating being met with the former.
100%. And I have so many thoughts on what you're saying. One, because, you know, if everyone's listened to the episodes or follows me or anything, you know, both of my children are actively in public school education. They both actively have special education or in special education and have IEPs. And my oldest has a one-on-one. And one of the things that, you know, we have learned through the past few years is that one-on-one has been the reason for him to access the general education setting and thrive. And, you know, we're in 4th grade now. We are in gifted, which is something that he was just like, I want to do it. And one of the things that he has learned about is trial. And so when you're doing IEPs and you're doing special education, one of the things that I've frequently had to go to the team and tell to my parents and have discussions about is a trial period.
That's correct.
Where a lot of my learners, I would say probably about now just a quarter, it used to be like 75% of my caseload. Families were coming to me because they had little black and brown children that were considered behavior issues and were being placed in self-contained. And so, but they were incredibly bright. And so the discussion was, how do we get them to access the general education setting? And that was parents' concern. And so I found myself very early on in my advocacy career, like speaking about trials and like, we can do a trial period for 30 days, 45 days, things like that. And so we have done this with my own child. And so now he has learned this word trial period.
Love it.
And the other day, his one-on-one was like, I didn't influence him either way or the other. He was like, but I asked him, what about if we start out in the gen ed setting in the morning instead of, right, special ed setting? And when I was talking to my son, he's like, well, what's your opinion? I was like, well, it's your choice, you know, and he's like, I know, I'm asking your opinion. And so I was like,
he is your son, Dustin.
Right. I was like so,
looking in a mirror with my son too. I get it.
Yeah. Oh no, we're definitely looking. It's the same person, you know, just a male. And I said, well, this is how I kind of look at things. I said, so what is it about that that you feel like you might miss, or what is it that you're getting that you feel like I would want that? And he was just like plain as day. He was like, snack. So at his school, all their grades do snack, which is amazing. But because of his grade and where they his team has decided to do snack. It's in like his afternoon class, his afternoon gen ed class. And so he's like, I like the fact that I get snack, I have lunch, and then I have snack again. And so I was like, okay, that's a discussion we can have. Yeah, right. And so,
like, I feel that in my soul.
Yeah, but he was just clear as day. He was like, snack. He's like, when I go in there in the morning, I get snack, And I'm like, okay. So, but he was just like, maybe we can do a trial and like see how it goes with me going to the gen ed. And like, so now he's well versed in like, he knows he has an IEP. He know like he's even asked to be in the meeting. Like he knows, yes. So this is, but one of the things you're really speaking to is that sometimes the district, and this goes back to that conversation where we were talking about like services versus support, right? Sometimes the districts and the schools, and I've noticed, and I'm sure Lisa does too, I've had like kids in the same district where the school approaches were different.
Oh, 100%. They were
it's
wild.
And it's like you're in an elementary school in this district and you're in an elementary school in this district, but it's two very different approaches.
Oh gosh, it's wild. It's absolutely wild when it happens, especially when it's like literally 180 degrees apart from each other.
Yeah.
Which is concerning, I have to say.
Yes, it is. It is. And that's why I always say your team matters.
Oh, 100%.
But when you're looking at that service piece, a lot of times, and going back to like the district approach, sometimes it's kind of like, this is how we do things, right? And so it's like, we've never had a learner with these behaviors, quote unquote, or this diagnosis. No, they have, but they'll say like, and they mean it. Yeah, in the sense of like, we've never had a learner with the XYZ in XYZ setting. And they mean that because they haven't, because they are used to putting them in that box and putting them in that space.
Right. Yes, I've had that experience too.
Yeah. And so when we're talking about services versus support, another thing you'll see is like they're doing really well, which you're not wrong. They are. But we're also, again, when Lisa had made the statement about micro versus macro, right? As the parent of a disabled learner, and then when you become an advocate supporting that family, we genuinely are thinking about the growth of the learner. And we are thinking about how does this decision, service, and support impact this learner from whatever grade we enter into supporting this family to the trajectory, right? How does that translate to middle school? How does that translate to high school?
Right.
And what we know historically is that a lot of learners in a self-contained setting historically do not get access to grade level content.
That is correct.
Historically, we know this, and any self-contained teacher will say like, hey, the ones that are upfront and honest, or just or if there is we have this trend now where there's like, we're doing K through 3 or K through 2 and 1, and then we're doing 3rd through 5th. But if your child, and I've experienced this, is the only certain grade in there, then that self-contained teacher is having a hard time giving them access to that content in there, because I've got, even if it's just, 7 kids, right? I've got 7 kids with this modified curriculum and 3 in each grade, and then your child is the only one. And so this content doesn't apply to them, right? And so I think when you go through that micro and macro, a lot of times, again, and I've said this many times, schools are reactive. And so because they're reactive, they a lot of times will default to they're making progress and we're not seeing X issues anymore. And they don't take that as growth and skill building for the learner as well as their staff, right? Because if this is something you're not seeing anymore, that a lot of times with neurodivergent learners has to do with their relationship with the staff. It does not have to necessarily do with the placement. And so then you in turn have to look at how do we carry that over throughout the parts of their day. And that's when we talk about, when Lisa's saying about that, looking through a micro lens versus a macro lens. And Lisa, I always say, correct me if I'm wrong about that interpretation.
No. I think you're absolutely right. And I think just on a personal note, because my children are adults and, I've shared this openly. My daughter was in 11 different placements, 12 now, if you count university. but there was a lot of trauma that happened within school, and so sometimes I'll bring out the big guns during an IEP meeting if I see decisions being made for a younger learner where I know it's going to result in harm. And I will say, as the parent of a now 20, she turned 20 yesterday, ADHDer, this is what this looks like when we don't do this. This is what this can look like down the line. What are they going to do? Tell me no?
But
Sometimes I get a little salty.
No, I mean, seriously though, but then on the other side of that too, it also goes back to what we mentioned about deficits and strengths, right? And, and I want to be clear when I say this because I know, and I'm blanking on her name right now. She's become a friend in the advocacy space. Her child is an adult now. And she talks about how, and I can't even remember her Instagram handle right now, but she's amazing. And she really talks about how she's been working with families of disabled individuals for I think it's 20 years now. But she talks about how it's so difficult that every time it comes up for her child's benefits, she has to dive into that deficit space to get him access. And she's like, it hurts me so much every time because the language or the wording that you use can convince them that, you no longer need this funding or support for your child for them to access all the wonderful things they're doing. And she's like, and that's not true, but I have seen growth, but they still need it. And so I say that because I want to be clear when we talk about the deficit piece, right? Even Lisa and I being neuroaffirming, when we are looking at our learners and how to support them and their families, we're still looking at the whole picture. I am still looking at the fact that this learner struggles with math fact fluency and problem solving. That's not what we're saying. And I think a lot of people think that's what being neuroaffirming means. No. And what it means is looking at the whole picture. And so it's saying, while this learner may be struggling with regulation and have executive functioning barriers, they also are academically primed to access higher level content than what may be being provided to them. And so how do we honor all of that? Right. And that's the piece that we often lose in looking at services and not supports, is that we're not looking at how do we use services, accommodations, and goals to help this learner access areas of strength?
Right. You're going to laugh at me because I'm going back to one of my other, foundational beliefs.
You're curious.
When I hear, to use your example, that a learner struggles with math fact fluency, my brain goes to, well, why? Let's get curious about it. What is it about that is inaccessible to them so that we can try to understand it so that we can then accommodate to remove the barrier. Right? So it is not uncommon, as I paint with a broad stroke, it is not uncommon for autistic learners to not do as well on timed assignments or assessments. Right. It's really common to see scores come in where whenever it says the word fluency, that means that assessment was timed. And I think there's a number of reasons behind why those scores start to falter. Right. And so it's not always the same for every single learner. So while the pattern might look this similar across learners, the reason behind it varies. So then can we try to understand what the barrier is for this individual learner so that we can create accommodations that actually make sense for them so that they can access it? Generally speaking, I think timed stuff is ridiculous anyway, so let's just not and say we did. But what does it inform in terms of access more broadly outside of situations that are timed? Right? Is there a motor planning piece at play? Is there an overstimulation? There's too much, shit on the page, and my brain's like, what is all that? And freeze. there's a whole host of things that could be happening. The pressure, the perfectionism, like there's a whole host of things that could be happening that are creating a barrier to access to, say, a math facts page, especially when that math facts page is timed. It's not just like, oh, we'll do the same thing, but you can take as long as you want. That might be supportive and helpful for one learner, but it might not remove all the barriers for another one. So to me, that curiosity piece is the key, or a key component in a neuro-affirming approach. It's yes, I acknowledge the whole human, and I'm deeply curious about this learner and how they're accessing or not accessing their education so that we can appropriately accommodate and support.
100%. And what you're talking about, though, is when you're getting curious, it's going past that assumption, presumption, and compliance, right? Because, historically, if you're not doing what I'm asking, you're non-compliant. If you are not following through with the task or request, it's because you don't want to. If you are upset or frustrated by something, you're being manipulative. If you are talking to me loudly or with curse words, you're being disrespectful. All of those things lead to not really understanding the gist behind it. And again, you all know, if you follow me, I don't want to hear no shit in the comments about, like, well, that is disrespectful or that's not okay. And it's like, that's not what I said. And you're not listening. You're listening to respond. You're not listening to understand. So stop it. What I'm referring to is the fact that we have been, and Lisa and I have talked about this before, like that's how we were raised. Like millennial, Gen Y, or millennial, Gen X, boomers, we were raised like, you don't talk back, you don't question, you don't, just do it, right? And I'm like, and that's why we're all in therapy now, right? So... But, I'm not going to go out because I'm a mental health therapist, don't forget. So I'm not going to go off on that tangent. But my point is that in order to be neuroaffirming, you have to ask why. And a lot of times what happens is, oh, they're autistic, so this is why this is happening. They're ADHD, so this is why this is happening. And that may not be wrong. It may be why the manifestation you're seeing is occurring. That doesn't mean that that is the reason, right? Being autistic is not why XYZ is happening. Being ADHD is not why XYZ is happening. Not understanding may be why it's happening. Not comprehending may be why it's happening. Not being able to regulate may be why it's happening. And so then once we get to that root cause, right, we're really able to look at, okay, now, how do we support them in accessing that? I cannot tell you how many times, and this is why I like having multiple teachers, but also dislike, right? Because when you have multiple teachers, you're battling everyone doing consistency across for the learner. But also when you have multiple teachers, you'll have that one teacher who themselves is often neurodivergent, and they are accommodating the learner because they're neurodivergent. And they're like, oh, well, I found this works with Destiny. And the other teachers are like, oh, I didn't think about that, right? And it may or may not work. It may be a thing where like they do need that accommodation, but only when dealing with math, right? It may not be, consistent across, but it means that they actually were like, hey, I wonder if, okay. And so when we talk about that piece too, when we go back to like that, connection, building those relationships, looking past the service. I can't tell you how many times I'm like, okay, how are we addressing regulation? And they will turn around and go, oh, that's why we wrote this goal, right? And this goal is about emotional regulation, social emotional regulation. And I'm like, cool. And then I'll go, okay, that's how you're addressing it. I'm like, so who's explicitly teaching it? Who is explicitly modeling it? And are you doing it while they are regulated? And now all eyes are on me and everyone's like, oh. And I'm like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. Now the wheels are turning. Now you're thinking about the fact of like, oh yeah, you can't do this while they're dysregulated. So that's what we mean when we talk about going past that piece, because the person that's going to be teaching that skill is also going to be building that relationship. They're also going to be able to observe and get curious and give insight about that learner. And that takes it from they have this social emotional goal they're not making progress on, to we are recognizing that some of these things that we previously thought would support destiny are actually triggers. And so we need to adjust our approach. Or we're recognizing, I had one IEP meeting where they were like, we recognize now that Destiny can tell us the coping skills, but they were like, Destiny doesn't recognize when she needs to use them.
Right. That's a key one.
And they were like, and that's introception. And then that's when we're like, OT, can you do some consultation? And OT was like, absolutely. And so we started to tweak it to support that learner.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing that I wanted to add to your list, which was really comprehensive and spot on the money, is the reason the learner is not accessing this because they don't perceive safety in the environment.
Ding, 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 ding. Cowbells. Do, 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 do.
Right. And I think that that's I don't want to say a hard question to bring up in an IEP meeting, but like it can be a little bit tricky to bring it up because that kind of question potentially can put folks back on their heels. Like I'm making an accusation that you're making this young person not
I was just going to say, can you talk about, because I just had this happen in an IEP meeting, and Lisa's like my go-to for PDA, by the way. But can you talk a little bit about that perceived safety and how you tackle that in IEP meetings when the staff, because a lot of times, so just as an insert, a lot of times my parents of my PDA learners, right, will note how the learner has that perceived safety at home. And then the staff in turn will feel like I'm not doing anything to make them unsafe or feel unsafe. So now I am defensive. So how can you talk a little bit in that of like how you tackle that?
Yeah, no, and it's tricky, right? It can be really tricky. So sometimes I'll start the conversation in the email before the meeting to just sort of lay a little bit of a foundation. But usually when I'm in the space, and I mean, I think that this is something that maybe is a little bit easier to do in the role of an advocate than it is the role of a parent. But certainly a parent could also take this approach. And I think the parent's voice, and I'm going to weave the parent in because I think the parent plays a big piece of this. But when I'm in an IEP meeting, especially with a PDA, I will say, you know, we're going to lift up some concerns about Lisa's disability. And I just want to state straight away that in no way, shape, or form are we lifting these things up because we think somebody is doing something wrong. We're not here to point fingers. This is really about how Lisa's brain works. Lisa's brain is hardwired to perceive threat in the environment. Right. And so it's really important for us to get curious about what are the ways that I had a parent come up with this expression, and I freaking love it, and I'm stealing it. And if she's listening, she'll know that I'm stealing her words, but I don't want to name her for confidentiality reasons. But I have a wonderful, wonderful parent of a young PDAer that is trying to coach the team on ways to fill this young person's autonomy bucket.
Okay.
Right. And so we know that the structure and the format of school, just the dynamic of what happens in a classroom, inherently sort of pull from that autonomy bucket. Right. And so we know that that's the infrastructure. So how do we add into the infrastructure ways to fill that autonomy bucket? And so I try to start the conversation, and I have been stealing that language from this wonderfully wise parent. But even before I had it, it's just like, I know that when a learner is having a difficult time and we come to the table to discuss that difficult time, it can feel, especially when an advocate shows up in the room, right? Like I just the elephant. It can feel like kind of an us-them attack. And I said, that is so not why we're in this space. We're in this space to be thought partners. We're in this space to get curious about what is happening for Lisa, but we
Mm-hmm.
do need to come to kind of a common understanding that this is just how Lisa's brain works. And this is, to tie the parent in, this is where I think it's really powerful. And I know that what I'm about to say can be incredibly difficult, especially if the parent is not perceiving safety in this relationship.
Right.
But it's really powerful for a parent to share their vulnerable journey,
Mm-hmm.
because we as parents have probably tried some disciplinary approaches. We've maybe tried some
Mm-hmm.
traditional behavioral type approaches. We've, please, if you do this, I'll give you a cookie, right? Like we've tried some of the
Mm-hmm.
things, we've fallen flat on our faces, it has not worked. And so we've had to humble ourselves and unlearn some of the things that we knew or thought we knew,
Mm-hmm.
and shift and pivot to meet the needs of our children. And it's a process, it's an ongoing process, but sometimes sharing that vulnerability makes it safer for the team to then be vulnerable and thoughtful and curious themselves. So I try to kind of set the foundation from the outset. I do think the approach of you will not be using any traditional behavioral, right, like coming in waving a finger, is
Mm-hmm.
not going to get you super far.
Right.
And I'm certainly not trying to like tone police anybody, but I do think just establishing, we've talked about this before, that both of us are big question askers. So
Mm-hmm.
like, I know we've spoken to this of sort of laying the foundation, and there goes my dog shaking her collar. Apologize for that. She's doing her own thing. Um, but just laying that foundation of like, it's almost like setting an expectation. We're here to
Mm-hmm.
learn. We're here to collaborate. We're here to center the humanity of my child.
Mm-hmm.
We're not here to look at the way their brain works through this deficit lens. We're here to recognize that this is how their brain works.
Right.
And we know that our child is objectively safe with you. And we know that their brain in this environment is going to perceive threat when they are objectively safe. But that's their lived experience, and we're not going to discipline it out of them. So we
Mm-hmm.
have to be consciously thinking about ways that we are accommodating their disability and cueing safety. And to bring Jess Hanzo from PDA Project, who I've
Mm-hmm.
learned so much of my understanding from,
Mm-hmm.
is this idea of brain state aligned accommodations. And I do feel
Mm-hmm.
like this is a pathway to acknowledge like the good work and the hard effort that the team is doing, and just getting curious around the timing of when they're doing it. And the example I typically use is like offering choices.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of ties back into what you were saying earlier in this conversation about we're doing everything in the IEP and like it's not working. Sometimes it's not that the thing in the IEP is bad, it's the timing of it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if we look at dysregulation and the accommodation of offering choices, just as an example, well, when a learner is relatively regulated or they're just starting to feel a little like, offering a choice or using some humor, great, wonderful.
Right.
But if
Mm-hmm.
that young person is under the table in the fetal position or on top of the table, like throwing things or, super dysregulated, like level 10,
Mm-hmm.
you offer that learner a choice and it is going to do nothing but further escalate the situation. So some of it is timing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a really great entry for educators to be thinking more deeply about their practice. Is you're not necessarily like, oh, you're not criticizing me. You are trying to get curious. I do always start with, I want to hear what it looks like from your perspective. And I'm asking this
Yes. That's so
not because I'm
important.
trying to critique your practice, because I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
better understand what's happening in the room so that we then together can like, I just had a meeting yesterday where this was the conversation. Um, and I think part of it, also going back to something you said earlier, is trying to listen to learn and collaborate, not listen to respond. So when I ask that question of what it looks like, I don't necessarily have like a predetermined response in my head. I really want to hear what's happening so that I can either ask more follow-up questions or get curious or lift up a wondering, or as what happened yesterday, say, you guys are doing really, really, really great work. And this de-escalation plan does not mirror what you are doing. So can we shift some of the language in this plan, going back to our documentation episode, can we shift some of the language in this plan so it actually reflects what you guys are intuitively already doing?
100%. And no, it's, you know, is the support, it's the timing of the support, it's the approach of support. I've had many times where choices are being given and I've literally heard, or they've repeated, like, when they've given an example, that it's like, you can either sit over here or you can go to the common corner. And it's like, that's not going to get me. Like, I'm like, now I'm elevating more. Right.
That's not
going to. And a lot of times I find myself in meetings too, when I'm talking with school teams, is saying to them, giving them examples that they can understand from an adult perspective, and saying, like, if you're dysregulated and your partner comes over and is like, it's not a big deal, don't be mad. And you could see some of them instantly shift. Their face is instantly offended. I had an administrator bust out laughing one time, and she literally went, I'm so sorry. It was like, because that would make me so mad. And I was like, this is what we're doing to the learner. We are invalidating their feelings and emotions and telling them how to feel. And I had, like, they were like, okay. And I was like, children are people too.
I literally was going to scream it. It would be like the script. Maybe we would have gotten it timing right, because I knew you were going to say it. And I'm like, yes, like, we're all human. This learner is a human. I don't know a single human when they're super upset that it's like the idea of, like, have the words calm down ever worked in the history of the world? No. Right? It's the same idea. Like, and this, I'm so getting into the weeds, but I can't help it. And then I lost it. Shit. It came back. Sometimes you'll see so well-meaning. And I just had a conversation earlier this week in one of my many, many meetings talking about this. And really from a place of curiosity, like, I'm lifting it up as my own curiosity. I don't have an answer. I really want input from all the different voices in the room to really center this learner and how they respond to this, because this is different people respond differently, to the, wow, you look frustrated, let's take a break. Like, that kind of language where the adults are naming the feeling for the learner. And I can see value in that sometimes. But I got to tell you, if I am pissed and somebody says to me, you look pissed, I'm like, you can fuck all the way off. Do not tell me how I'm feeling.
And my thought is, like, you look pissed. And I'm like, no shit. And yet here you are talking to me. Like, that's going to make it better. But I mean, and that's what we mean about, though, learning from, like, lived experience, though, because, again, Lisa and I are both neurodivergent, and we are telling you how, like, our brains work in that regard. And so that's why you get, and I've had this happen a lot, where my elementary or middle or high schoolers are saying, like, you can fuck all the way off. And the teacher's like, oh my God. And it's like they're saying the thing that it's like, yes, they're not supposed to say it, but we go back to that power dynamic, right? Like, I've talked about it many times, where neurodivergent children do not see that dynamic. They do not see this, like, you're the adult, I'm the child. It's like, we're all people. And then society teaches that dynamic. And then they're like, oh, that's why I'm not supposed to say that to you, right? And so I think we just go back again to, you know, as we wrap the episode up, when we're talking about services and supports, I hope that everyone listening has really gathered from this that we're saying you have to look past the black or white. You have to look past, I'm offering this OT service. I'm offering this speech service. We have these goals built around regulation. We have these accommodations for executive functioning. They have an AAC device. Yes, okay, that's great. You have all those pieces in place for this learner, but you really have to look at, how is it being implemented? How is it being provided? How are you approaching it? Is the team on the same page? I have had it where, and I love this, by the way, to my gen ed teachers listening. I've had a gen ed teacher just blatantly say, I really know what that looks like for my classroom. And they've blatantly said, like, does that mean I'm doing this? Does that mean I'm doing that? And sometimes I'll notice like administration or the special ed teacher kind of like gasp a little bit, like, you said that in front of the parent and the advocate. And it's like, no, but that's what I want to hear, because what you're saying is, I want to implement this with fidelity, using it in the correct way.
That is correct.
And I want to do it, but I just don't know how. Like, we had one where, and I do think this educator is neurodivergent themselves, I will say. But we had one where there was a desk situation, and it was about like being away from distractions and things like that, and, where the desk would be located. And the educator just said, like, yeah, my classroom has tables. So how do I replicate that? Like, what does that look like? And then this also was a subject where the learner really enjoys the class, enjoys the subject. You're not seeing a need to adjust seating in that classroom. And that's what she brought to the forefront, was like, she's like, I want to make sure I'm understanding, because I know, like, I am legally required to provide these things. Sure. And she was like, and I'm not understanding what that would look like in my setting. And so we got into a conversation about what that would look like, and is that necessary, and how that would be. And so I think it's just very important, again, that you go past it and you ask those questions and really individualize it to the learner.
I love that so much. The last thing I really want to say, because I think it's so important, and I don't know if we've ever really named this out loud, is you have to actually really like the learner and care about them and show up in a way where they authentically feel that. Because kids know if you don't like them, or they perceive themselves to be a burden in your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And we have mentioned that, like, kids know when you don't like them.
Kids know when you don't like them. So you have to I need you to genuinely delight in the learners in your space.
And get curious about why you don't too. Because sometimes it's a mirror reflection. I've seen that with a lot of parents, where they're just like, the thing that bothers me that my child does is the thing that I do that bothers me that I do it.
Right.
And so I respond that way. But like, what is it? Or is it because the system is telling you that should be an issue, and you're trying to snuff it out and it's not working? And so now you're frustrated and irritated. Or is it because you have a view of how your classroom should look, and this learner is, upsetting that view? Right. Like, what is it?
Right. Exactly. And while you are working all of that out, you better be faking it till you make it in a way that resonates with the learner, that they feel loved and safe in your space. Because if they do not, it doesn't matter what's in that paper. There is no real learning that is happening.
100%. So, yeah, hopefully, again, this episode is really about looking past the services and looking at the support. And at the end of the day, what you're really hearing from us is you have to get curious. You have to build a relationship. You have to get to know that learner, and you really have to check your own bias and stereotypes and perceptions in order to really be able to support them. And so hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode, and hopefully you listen to our next episode, which is our last episode for part 1 of this season. We're super proud of ourselves that we made it through.
We're organized enough.
Right, because we be all over the place. But we're super proud and happy that it's coming up because it is talking about us being neurodivergent parent and advocating for neurodivergence. So we will see you next time. Thank you again for joining us here in the Affirming Village. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff and Lisa Baskin Wright, and we hope today's conversation leaves you feeling seen, supported, and better equipped to advocate for yourself or your learner. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone else in the village. Until next time, keep advocating, keep affirming, and keep building the village we all deserve.